Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speaker, Ambassador Diedrah Kelly, Canada Ambassador to ASEAN, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you for attending our ASEAN at CSIS webinar. Today, we discuss the outlook for ASEAN in 2021. Discussing the agenda for Brunei Chairmanship. Without further ado, I would call CSIS Executive Director, Dr. Phillips J. Vermonte, to convey his opening remark.
Hi, thank you, Fitri. Good afternoon, Your Excellency, Ambassador Diedrah Kelly, Ambassador of Canada Mission to ASEAN, distinguished speakers, Dr. Asyura Salleh, Non-Resident Vasey Research Fellow, Rachel Arinii Judhistari of the East Asia and Asia Program Manager, ASEAN Forum for Human Rights and Development, Forum Asia in short, and my colleague, Andrew Mantong, researcher at the Department of International Relations at CSIS. Ladies and gentlemen, participants of this webinar, both in the online meeting room and in our live broadcast. CSIS Indonesia, in collaboration with the Forum Asia and with the support of the Canada Mission to ASEAN, is organizing this webinar titled The Outlook for ASEAN in 2021, discussing the agenda for Brunei's chairmanship. The CSIS Indonesia organized a regular webinar with the aim at broadening interest among policymakers, intellectuals, diplomatic community for the rapidly evolving dynamics in the Southeast Asian region and in the Pacific, as well as generating constructive policy debates on prominent issues in the region. If you are interested in finding out more about CSIS event in the past, you can just check our YouTube channel and you will find a lot of discussions about ASEAN as well as other issues relevant to Southeast Asia and Indonesia in particular. Brunei Darussalam is the chair of ASEAN for 2021, and the theme of the ASEAN chairmanship of Brunei Darussalam is "We care, we prepare, we prosper." I think this is a very relevant theme and a very timely theme to be picked by Brunei Darussalam. And this theme aims to promote three fundamental areas, namely caring for the well-being of ASEAN people, preparing for future opportunities and challenges, and prospering together as a unified region. However, with the growing geopolitical dynamic and the COVID-19 pandemic, it rhymes, ASEAN has experienced a slowdown in economic development and continues to face unprecedented challenges posed by the pandemic and geopolitical shift. With such challenges, Brunei chairmanship needs to address the issues important to ASEAN through cooperation and collaboration with various stakeholders within ASEAN, as well as with dialogue partner. And once again, we thank Canada Mission to ASEAN for continued support in this endeavor. This webinar will also highlight cooperation and opportunity between ASEAN and Canada in particular under Brunei chairmanship. I wish we are going to have 1.5 hour discussion discussing this very particular relevant topic, both for Brunei and Canada, as well as Southeast Asia in general. Thank you very much. Over to you, Fitri.
Thank you very much, Dr. Philip Vermonte, Executive Director from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS Indonesia. I would hand the screen now to our moderator for today, Dr. Lina Alexandra. She's the Senior Researcher at the International Relations Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS Indonesia. Mbak Lina? The screen is yours.
All right. Thank you, Fitri. Good afternoon once again, everyone. Welcome again to the CSIS event in collaboration with Forum Asia and with the support of the Canada Mission to ASEAN. On the title of Outlook for ASEAN in 2021, discussing the agenda for Brunei's chairmanship. As we all know, ASEAN was born in 1967. So it's almost 54 years old in this year, in August. And of course, when we look at the age of ASEAN, it is definitely a mature and a thriving institution. And it has created relatively a stable region that we enjoy now. But certainly, the organization remains facing formidable challenges internally and externally. We see challenges starting from major power competitions, as we all witnessed for the past decades, and even until now in the South China Sea, for example. And we see real challenges to human security, as we are not only in the region, of course, in the global level, it's the pandemics. And Southeast Asia region, particularly, also very prone areas to natural disasters. And also, at the same time, we are still struggling with human rights issues, human rights problems, that while seemingly national in scope, but have implications to the region, to other countries in the region, as well as putting ASEAN's credibility in front of other countries in the world. So, because it is very important, because as we all know, ASEAN, since it issues the charter, it has commitment to push for human rights promotion and protection. With the new chairmanship coming up in 2021 under Brunei chairmanship, we certainly have hope and expectations on how the new chairman, Brunei, is going to bring ASEAN into a better future, a more relevant regional organization, which is measured by its capacity to deal with the above-mentioned challenges that I mentioned earlier. Internally, we are looking forward how the Brunei chairmanship will inspire other member states to strengthen ASEAN community, especially its pillars, political, security, economic, and social culture pillars. And of course, in the relations with major powers, how ASEAN can truly exert its centrality. So, and also with regard to the ASEAN Vision 2025, it's only 4 years to go. That's why this chairmanship is important, as we are much closer now to achieve the tangible progress on this community project, creating integrated, peaceful, and stable community. And for this year, at least under the Brunei chairmanship, we hope the vision, as mentioned earlier by Dr. Phillips, we care, we prepare, we prosper, can be achieved in this year under the Brunei chairmanship. So we now very privileged to have 4 distinguished speakers this afternoon. So I now like to give the floor to Andrew Mantong, our researcher from Department of International Relations in CSIS, and the second floor later to Dr. Asyura Salleh, non-resident Vasey research fellow from the Pacific Forum, and the third floor to Rachel Arinii Judhistari, the East Asia and ASEAN Program Manager in Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development, Forum Asia, and of course, the Excellency, Her Excellency Ambassador Diedrah Kelly, Ambassador of Canada Mission to ASEAN. I would like to give 15 minutes, around 15 minutes maximum to each speaker, so we can accommodate questions and inputs from the floor later on. And also for those who would like to give questions or comments, you can put it in the Q&A feature available in the Zoom. Or if you follow our event from YouTube, you can also type your question in YouTube live chat. And I, as a moderator, will read selected questions, because sometimes the question can be combined all together. So please, now, Andrew.
Thank you, Lina, for your kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I especially want to greet my friend Asyura from Brunei. How are you, Asyura? It's been a long time we don't meet each other. I would also like to give my warm regards to Ambassador Kelly. Nice to meet you, and Miss Rachel from Forum Asia. Thank you again for CSIS Forum Asia and Canadian Embassy for inviting me to give my perspective on what can be done by Brunei in 2021. Regarding my presentations, can I share my screen, Lina?
Yes, please.
Okay, is it visible? Is it visible now?
Yes, very clear.
Okay. So I would like to begin my presentations by saying that even though we have been talking about great challenges facing ASEAN region, such as great power competitions and then shift in industrial revolution, as well as the challenge coming from the current pandemics, I would like to touch some issues based on the what I call the institutional perspective on ASEAN and how ASEAN can proceed in 1 year or probably 2 years ahead with regards to these challenges. Because sometimes as an observer or as someone who works closely with ASEAN in recent years, for example, when I work with an ASEAN pillar on developing some work plan in combating transnational crimes and terrorism, sometimes there are a bit gap between what can we expect coming from ASEAN as an institutions and what should be done in terms of geopolitical challenges from ASEAN and of ASEAN countries. And I hope by presenting this sort of a bit more national or institutional view, we can further have a dialogue on how we can move forward with existing ASEAN mechanism. I would like to begin by touching upon the issues, the sort of legal issues of what is expected to be done by any Asian chair, including Brunei. The first task or the first role expected from ASEAN chair, according to the ASEAN Charter, is to actively promote and enhance the interests and well-being of ASEAN, including efforts to build an Asian community through policy initiatives, coordinations, consensus, and cooperations. Here, I would like to highlight the words making policy initiatives, coordination, consensus, and cooperation. This is direct translations of the ongoing norms of ASEAN, which relies on consensus building and sort of agreement to sort of come up with decision-making issues. And the ASEAN Chair also have to ensure the centrality of ASEAN. And any ASEAN chair should also ensure an effective and timely response to urgent issues or crisis situations affecting ASEAN, including providing its good offices and such other arrangements to immediately address these concerns. And I believe that this is also has been done by the Vietnam chair in 2020 with regards to COVID-19. It's not easy to sort of transform the usual mode of conduct of ASEAN, as we know as a diplomatic community, to a web-based diplomatic community in the face of COVID-19. And I think with these regards, we have to give some sort of applause to Vietnam leadership in 2020. The chair also have to represent ASEAN in strengthening and promoting closer relations with external partners and to carry out such other tasks and functions as may be mandated. Given this sort of institutional framework, we now have to look at the current dynamics. It's the leadership position has been transferred from Vietnam to Brunei in 2020 to 2021. Sorry, it's a bit confusing here. 2020 is, some people say it's already a lost momentum because Vietnam has come up with the big agendas. There are some high expectations that the declaration of a code of conduct would be realized in Vietnam chairmanship. But then again, the pandemic hit. So many observers have said that this is already a lost momentum for ASEAN, not only for Vietnam chair. And 2021 is a year of recovery. Hopefully, if the virus is not sort of mutating and having creating another kind of problems in this region. And if we look at the changes of the agenda from Vietnam to Brunei chairmanship, we see the shift from the cohesive and responsive ASEAN to the one that has been presented by Pa Phillips earlier. We care, we prepare, and we prosper. How does it mean for ASEAN? And how does it mean for Brunei to translate this agenda? There are some key points of each word reflected in the agenda. The first is related to the word care. The elaboration of this word is about harnessing the caring nature of ASEAN. So this is very interesting, since the Brunei portray that ASEAN is sort of having this caring nature. It probably goes back to the reason why ASEAN was established in the very first place. In elementary schools in Indonesia, we sometimes learn that ASEAN is not a political security cooperation. It is essentially built as a socio-political organization. So the nature of building resilience is always inherent in ASEAN, even though since 2003, we sort of have these political security pillars. For Brunei, caring means collective efforts for a swift recovery from COVID-19 with major focus on vaccine coordination. We seek to eliminate human consequences on the pandemic. And this is very interesting from Brunei priority is to put forward the issues of mental health for the plan of post-COVID-19 recovery. And further efforts to promote knowledge and skills required for the post-COVID-19 world and to answer the fourth industrial revolution in the region. With the word prepare, Brunei seek to prepare ASEAN for the future. So it means ensuring a rule-based architecture of ASEAN, adhering to international law and multilateral rules, relying on ASEAN-led mechanism to promote constructive relations with major powers and partners with the principle of strong and diverse partnerships. And with the word prosper, it seeks to create opportunities and enhance sustainable prosperity in the region. Here, specifically, it means anticipating further the rising of protectionism and self-serving nationalism, adjusting the ongoing disruption and positioning ASEAN in the post-COVID-19 era. It seeks to complement each other's ASEAN member states' economy, promoting greater public-private partnerships to make ASEAN more attractive to external partners, including relying on agreed RCEP framework, especially moving forward with ratification and implementation. So this is what it means by we care, we prepare, we prosper. But seeing at how observers, medias, and officials expressing their concerns on what to do in ASEAN, it seems that we have been in a situation where the challenges of geopolitical competitions is marked by national government actions toward COVID-19. So having said that, I think if we want to sort of ponder how ASEAN can move forward in coordinating these efforts, and we sort of categorize all the discourse into several categorization, I think we can find at least 5 expectations that we sometimes address towards ASEAN and towards any ASEAN chair agenda, including Brunei this year. So when it comes to the questions of geopolitical competitions, when it comes to the questions of how do we seek to further integrate ASEAN community as a single market, as a region of prosperity, and so on and so forth, we sometimes always come back to these questions: how do we reconcile our geopolitical outlook regarding competing ideas of Indo-Pacific, Belt and Road initiatives, and so on and so forth? How do we build a better ASEAN coherence? How do we reform ASEAN institutions? How do we review ASEAN-Charter? And how do we collectively respond to emerging crises and move forwards with our existing framework, for example, COC, RCEP, and another kind of ASEAN mechanism or ASEAN derivative mechanism such as ADMM+. I would like to categorize the ongoing observations toward ASEAN and the expectations toward ASEAN today into 5 big tasks that later I would like also to fit this into what my question about what Brunei should do with regards to this big task. The first big task is to review and update the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, because it can be the answer of ASEAN in responding how major powers increasingly project their geopolitical ideas towards the region. And the second is to review ASEAN community blueprints and develop post-2025 ASEAN vision, which is already 4 years from now. And the third big task is to review ASEAN-Charter, and then to coordinate efforts for post-COVID-19 recovery, and to move forward with the COC negotiations. I would probably not talk too much about COC negotiations in the hope that our next speaker would elaborate this further in more sound manner than I can probably. For the first big task is to coordinate efforts of post-COVID-19 recovery. If we look at the latest document from the ASEAN ministerial meetings recently held in January, there are already at least four tasks devised by the ASEAN to come up with some sort of efforts of post-COVID-19 recovery. The first is to implement the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, and then to coordinate efforts to establish the ASEAN Travel Corridor Arrangement Framework, or in other words, the travel bubble, sort of the regional travel bubble, and to operationalize the ASEAN Regional Reserve of Medical Supplies for public health emergencies and emerging disease, and to utilize the COVID-19 ASEAN Response Fund in the procurement of vaccines, medical supplies, and equipment for ASEAN people. For this task, I think the vision of ASEAN-Chair, Brunei ASEAN-Chair, has been quite instrumental in translating some sort of initiatives into actual problems. But I think the most challenging task later would be on how Brunei can play its leadership in coordinating efforts, especially with dialogue partners. How to make sure that there would be no overlaps between the initiatives coming from one dialogue partners to the other dialogue partners. How do we use existing mechanisms such as ASEAN Plus 3? How do we move forward with the upon agreed ASEAN Recovery Fund? And how do we seek innovative measures with existing ASEAN derivatives and ASEAN-centered mechanism? The experience of the SARS pandemic in a decade ago, it shows that there are some lag between national capacities and regional capacities in dealing collectively with the pandemics. And I think this is also a wake-up call for ASEAN to come up in better harmonizing efforts at national level to regional level. For the second task, reviewing and updating the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, it's more related to how to move forward with the so-called living document. Some officials I've been talking to with regards to this document, they said that the outlook is actually a living document. So it always open for review, it always open for updates and so on and so forth. And the first time I read the document, and the way I see the condition now, it's somewhat a bit puzzling for me, because the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific portray the region as if this is a region of cooperation, this is a region of maritime issues and so on and so forth, but sometimes it fails to capture the region as a multiple sites of disaster and where pandemic happens. And I think with regards to the current situations, we can always review and update the document by saying this is also the document where disaster happens. This is also the region where disaster happens. This is also the region that can be vulnerable if someday another pandemic can happen in the region. The task also involved developing a more coherent plan or strategy to translate the document into workable points. Some people have criticized this document as only outlook, not the strategy, and how to move forward is a big questions. And I think at the implementation level, the task of reviewing and updating the ASEAN outlook in Indo-Pacific also requires ASEAN to encourage its external partners to support and undertake cooperation with ASEAN in accordance with the principles contained in the outlook, including encourage cooperation in the 4 identified key areas. But most interestingly for Brunei is today to come up with big, innovative measures in order to make this document as a feasible document. There are some ideas related to how the maritime vision can be furthered by countries like Brunei. One of the ideas is by looking into smaller mechanism, for example, looking at the ASEAN-X mechanism. And here, with regards to ASEAN maritime countries, there have been some ideas from dialogue partners, for example, from Korea, to begin again looking into sub-regional mechanisms such as BIM-EAGA in order to harmonize coordination and cooperation within the ASEAN maritime countries. This is kind of idea that probably worth exploring for Brunei. The third task is to review ASEAN community blueprints and developing post-2025 ASEAN vision. Why this is important? Because I think with regards to the current issues such as regional health crisis, climate change, managing rule-based regional order, facing protectionism and populism, these are the kind of issues that is multidimensional in character. So this is something that ASEAN should reform, because looking at ASEAN, how ASEAN work every day, reconciliating tasks performed by the pillar of the socio-cultural community, political security community, and ASEAN economic community is a bit challenging today. Because, for example, in the issues of cyber threat, where these issues goes to, does it fall under the purview of ASEAN political and security community, or does it more related to ASEAN economic community? This is a kind of question that I think the ASEAN still figuring out how to make a concerted efforts in dealing with this kind of issues. And other than that, when the mechanism has been found later, we should also move forward to make sure that there would be some sort of reliable repertoire for monitoring and evaluation, and some sort of coordinating efforts to work with dialogue partners, because most of resources usually coming from dialogue partners. What Brunei should do is to look into specific areas that can be a sort of example. For example, on the area of terrorism and trafficking in person, where ASEAN has come up with convention, and then translate its convention into work plan, and then the work plan has been equipped by some sort of annual mechanism on how to monitor the achievement of its goal as reflected in the work plan. There are already some kind of modalities that has been found at the more micro level of ASEAN that can be used for Brunei to sort of inventorize how ASEAN can move forward. And this could be instrumental if we want to build another kind of ASEAN vision post 2025.
Andrew, sorry.
Yes.
We just have 1 minute to go.
Okay.
Can you just wrap up, please? Thank you.
Sure. And this is also related to the move for us to review ASEAN-Charter. All the questions about ASEAN institutional capacity sometimes is more related to how ASEAN is founded institutionally. We still have a problem with institutional reforms. We still have the unresolved questions about how to promote and how to protect human rights at the regional level, how to come up with better decision-making mechanism, and how do we build a better dispute settlement mechanism to make ASEAN really central in the whole regional process, and to make sure that ASEAN can preserve its so-called ASEAN unity. This is not an easy task, and I think it's also related to the moving forward the COC negotiations. It's more related to the nature of Brunei and to the skepticism directed sometimes to Brunei. This can be elaborated by any speakers later. But at this point, I would like to see that the most challenges for Brunei today is how Brunei can prove to ASEAN member states that it becomes, since 2000 and since the last time Brunei chaired the ASEAN in 2013, as Brunei has been a trustworthy member of ASEAN, and this boiled down to the questions, especially on the COC negotiation, whether Brunei can balance efforts of its dual track approach in relying on bilateral measures to solve disputes, including South China Sea, while at the same time adhering to ASEAN mechanism and international law, especially on UNCLOS. It also boils down to the question on how do we anticipate the issues of 2021 Defense White Paper with a Brunei agenda in sharing ASEAN. And this also related to the questions whether Brunei efforts in trying to diversify its economy from only relying on energy towards other more built and sort of developed economy, by making sure that there are some balanced influence between China investment and continuing British presence that sometimes mark the Brunei capacity in dealing with security measures. And with this task, I think there have been some good hopes that Brunei is looking forward to promote some kind of ASEAN strength in developmental measures. But this kind of security dimensions of the equation is still coming with the very big questions. With that, I would like to end my presentations. Thank you, Lina.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you. Sorry to cut you off, but thank you for your excellent presentation to give a general overview about the benchmark that the role of ASEAN-Chair should play, and expectations, and like very concrete suggestions on what the Brunei should do in his term as a chairman of ASEAN this year. All right, we move to the second speaker, Dr. Asyura Salleh. As Andrew hint earlier, that Dr. Asyura hopefully can give a more specific priority areas that Brunei chairmanship probably can pursue under its period of chairmanship. Please, Dr. Asyura Salleh.
Thanks very much, Dr. Lina, and also thank you very much to the organizers of CSIS Jakarta for really having me on board for what I think is an extremely timely discussion. As usual, so lovely to see old friends and also new friends amongst the panel and also amongst the participants. So I'm going to try share my slides. Just let me know. Can you see this?
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to mention a small, tiny caveat that I am from Brunei Darussalam, but I'm unfortunately no way affiliated with the government. And so most of my observations are really from the same viewpoint we all have, which is far removed from the intricacies of foreign policy making that takes place in the government. My views are of my own and in no way a representation of any of the institutions that I am affiliated with. So we're in 2021 now, but this is no fresh start for any of us. The crisis that really befell most of 2020 continues unabated into this new calendar year. Brunei Darussalam, as this year's ASEAN Chair, has found itself really tackling this heavy role. Having witnessed Vietnam as its predecessor battle the sudden onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Brunei is now tasked with forging ahead and with really guiding the region into some semblance of a new normal. The pandemic has definitely reshaped the region's landscape. It's acted as a catalyst to further development in some areas, and it has also obstructed progress in others. And so as we enter 2021, we are filled with this very measured sense of relief that perhaps the worst may be over, but also of this realistic uncertainty as we try to make sense of this newly restructured landscape. So I was under the impression that I had 20 minutes, so I will try my very best to try condense it within 15. I do apologize in advance. I'll also try compliment Andrew's talk, which I thought was really well done, but I'll try add more of a maritime security angle. So what I'll be doing is I'll first address this uncertainty that we talk about by really carving out some trends that we can expect in this year's maritime security landscape. I'll then try gauge Brunei's rationale in really trying to approach this landscape as ASEAN-Chair. I'll then end with really looking into what we can expect would be Brunei's priorities in fostering maritime security cooperation this year. Okay. And so building on the precedents set forth by 2020, there are several driving factors which may continue to permeate our maritime environment this year. Obviously, we will continue seeing continued strategic competition between the United States and China. Funnily enough, we also saw how the pandemic had little to no impact in really slowing down this rate of competition. At sea, China continued to assert its sovereign rights to disputed territory, and the US continued to challenge China's influence by insisting on international norms and by conducting freedom of navigation operations. But interestingly, we also saw how the strategic competition had a direct impact on states within Southeast Asia. Several countries like Malaysia have had their supply ships closely followed and harassed. Others, such as Indonesia, have had incursions into their fishing grounds. And all this took place against a backdrop of a flurry of exchanged diplomatic notes. We're also getting growing interest from states such as Australia, Japan, South Korea, India, France, Canada, and the United Kingdom. And each and every one of these nations have demonstrated a growing commitment to want to ensure maritime security in the South China Sea. Their commitment has come in the form of declarations of support and even direct assistance to our naval and maritime law enforcement agencies through the provision of surveillance technology, patrol assets, and even training. But upon this layer of growing multipolarity and growing complexity in the region, COVID-19 was added to the mix, right? And with it, it brings with it its own unique structural factors. We saw this highly contagious virus permeating across national borders. International travel came to a close as land, water, and also air borders were shut. We saw regional governments turning inward, trying to focus their attention on containing the rapid spread of infections. And we saw border security heightening to deter the flow of irregular migrants, which may unsuspectingly carry this virus. And so as countries prioritized supporting their health systems that were crippling under these national emergencies, state budgets also came under pressure. Funding was directed away from defense spending, where countries like Thailand faced a defense budget that was potentially shrinking by 8%. And obviously with this, we're getting fears of isolationism and even nationalism mounting across the region. But even for those lucky enough to escape the infection, they were still affected by COVID-19. There's an income shock created by the sudden closure of businesses, regional economies suffering, and unemployment rates rising. A survey conducted by the Asian Development Bank reported that 73% of all the households they surveyed actually reported an income decline. And so this meant that citizens that once used to work in busy cities like Manila were now returning to their coastal homes without employment and are forced to turn to fishing, illegal fishing, as a means to sustain their livelihood. And lastly, this crisis is further compounded with the growing exploitation and mismanagement of undersea resources. Overfishing remains a perennial threat, undermining the region's fragile ecosystem and marine habitat, reducing fish catch, heightening food insecurity. And this has caused a gray zone problem, because out of desperation, we're getting more and more fishermen being pushed further out to sea in search for more food, in search for more income, and some even crossing into foreign territory, risking inflaming current regional sensitivities over maritime jurisdiction. So when combined, the above drivers really point to several developing trends, which I think we can anticipate this year. Quite clearly, we will see more activity at sea. This can take place in the form of continued militarization of reclaimed land and even expansion of bases, such as the Yulin Naval Base in Hainan. We're going to see the rapid modernization of fleets. Indonesia's Bakamla patrol vessels are to be outfitted with machine guns, for example. We're going to see more forward projection, as I think of Sunday, a US aircraft carrier group is now operating in the South China Sea, not long after Taiwan reported incursions of Chinese bombers and fighter jets. We also have countries like the United Kingdom announcing that their aircraft carrier, the HMS Elizabeth, will be accompanied with an American destroyer on its journey to the South China Sea this year. But I think what's important is that, in the recent conversations that I've been having in the past 3 weeks, it seems like forever, but really 2021 has just started. Most analysts and experts have been raising caution about another dangerous trend. And this is one that's caused by the pressures exerted by COVID-19. And this is the continuous and worrying rise of transnational maritime crime, also known as non-traditional security threats. As of last year, piracy and armed robbery incidents increased by 17% as compared to 2019. We're also getting conventional criminal networks being displaced by the travel restrictions. And so they're adopting new smuggling modus operandi and new waterways to continue their trade, all the while being able to evade enforcement authorities, which are distracted by the pandemic. I mentioned that there was a high level of unemployment, pushing more coastal communities to participate in these activities. There's growing smuggling of migrants, drugs, and even basic necessities such as meat, fuel, and rice, which would otherwise have been easily accessible. But yeah, sure, you can look at these concerns and say, okay, they may seem relatively more benign, but really this rise in maritime crime is a symptom of crippling economies, suffering populations, and overstretched enforcement resources. Another trend we need to look out for is that as both these two types of threats emerge in our maritime security landscape, we're seeing more and more actors come to fore. We've acknowledged the growing presence of regional and extra-regional partners, but there are also more stakeholders realizing their roles and their responsibilities. We're getting fishery departments, marine scientists, information fusion centers, and even coastal preservation NGOs, all demanding for a seat at the table. And so it is high time for governments to better involve them in their conversations that are being held at the bilateral and regional forums in ASEAN. Last but not least, what COVID-19 has done is place these blinkers, right, on our maritime law enforcement agencies. We're seeing our enforcement officers being bound to land, to avoid catching the risk of the virus at sea, and also the health precautions are forcing many of them to work in shifts or even work from home. Multilateral exercises have been modified, postponed, or held virtually to accommodate these restrictions. And what this has done is that it has impacted patrol time at sea, and many agencies are unable to develop real-time situational awareness of developments as they take place. So I think we will be able to anticipate this growing momentum of support for more maritime domain awareness and information sharing initiatives. We will see heavier reliance or preference for the use of technology, such as satellite imagery, so they can continue monitoring the sea from land, and more coordination can be expected in exchanging information and participating in virtual discussions. All right, so where does Brunei stand amidst all these changes? This was earlier alluded to by Andrew and also Dr. Phillips, where a brief look at statements do indicate that Brunei's priority as ASEAN-Chair would be to spearhead a year of recovery from COVID-19 and to focus on healing the region. Upon taking chairmanship, the Sultan Haji Hassan al-Bolkiah emphasized ASEAN's theme, which is we care, we prepare, and we prosper. And these three themes, really, if we look at it, do outline a step-by-step process towards recovery. And this process is also broad enough to address several issues under them. As Andrew mentioned, this includes mental health, vaccine distribution, and cybersecurity. In his speech as well, the Sultan recognized the challenges posed by COVID-19 and the importance in harnessing ASEAN's strength and centrality in tackling them. His message was reiterated by Brunei's Foreign Minister, Datuk Seri Setia Haji Erawan, in a talk held with Yusof Ishak ICs last month, where he called for prioritizing peace and stability, supporting the rules-based architecture, and also utilizing ASEAN-led mechanisms to really promote more constructive relations among all powers. And we are seeing these statements materializing in action. Brunei has hit the ground running, with the ASEAN Foreign Ministers retreat last week underscoring the need to pursue a strategic and holistic initiative to link ASEAN responses to emergencies and disasters. It has reaffirmed the principles of the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, and it has emphasized a multilateral approach towards establishing external relations. The country's determination to take its chairmanship responsibilities quite seriously is displayed in its decision to allocate $2 million to its efforts as ASEAN Chair. When this budget was announced in March last year, Brunei also recognized it has a larger role to play in the regional and international fora. But in addition to wanting to uphold its own foreign policy, Brunei has also expressed a desire to be a facilitator of diplomatic relations between countries. But Brunei is faced with this unique challenge of really continuing to uphold these roles within a COVID-restrained environment. The notional calendar here was released over the weekend, and here we can see that Brunei has planned for most meetings to take place on virtual platforms. What this has done is that it has limited the dinners and the physical interactions that would have otherwise taken place. Only towards the end of the year has Brunei accommodated more physical events, and this includes the ASEAN Maritime Forum in November. But the thing is, to be able to consider physical interaction in the first place is actually an advantage in itself, because as compared to most countries in the region, Brunei has successfully managed to keep its rate of community transmissions to a near zero in the most of last year. So Brunei is therefore well poised in coordinating most ASEAN events, as it does have an opportunity more than others to hold physical discussions and engagements in the future. And so through these narratives, I'm able to gather that Brunei does perceive its chairmanship role as one that requires gently guiding the region towards a more stable status quo. And I think this is something Brunei is well trained and accustomed to, especially with its dual-pronged approach, which Andrew mentioned, as it has delicately managed relations and tried to maintain neutrality amidst territorial disputes, while consistently calling for progress and rejecting the use of force. I know there is much hope for me to be a maritime security expert in following the code of conduct developments, but I wouldn't consider myself such an expert, especially when it comes to these territorial disputes. In fact, I think this is something my fellow panelists and even the participants can better attest to. But in my view, I do see that this small nation of Brunei does hold a strong promise as an appropriate leader to take the helm as ASEAN-Chair during this trying period. Brunei's stance towards regional politics have long been described as hedging, an appropriate and realistic response as a regional state smack in the middle of Southeast Asia. Several scholars have in fact pointed to how in fact all countries in Southeast Asia are adopting different degrees of hedging, primarily because no state in the region would desire to be in a position to be forced to choose between two powers. And so like its neighbors, Brunei has consciously adopted this foreign policy, and will in fact continue to do so through statements of non-alignment, diversifying external relations with more countries, and also adopting a neutral policy without explicitly pronouncing so. So we've eked out a really rough rationale to Brunei's direction as ASEAN-Chair. And the next question really would be if Brunei's priorities do align with the security threats that have been anticipated this year. There are three ways in which I think Brunei would continue fostering maritime security cooperation in 2021. The first, being strategically well-positioned, Brunei would continue utilizing its advantageous foreign policy posture to sternly but gently push for peace and stability in the South China Sea. And this priority has already been demonstrated by the fact that the ASEAN-China Joint Working Group on the implementation of the Declaration on the Conduct has actually been the third meeting of the year, and this is according to the notional calendar. And the statement from the recently held Foreign Ministers' retreat also echoed this firm but balanced approach, underscoring the importance of effectively implementing the declaration and also the early conclusion of a code of conduct. But more importantly, this statement also pragmatically outlined the abrasive outcomes of developments in the South China Sea. It has eroded trust and confidence, it has increased tensions, and it has also undermined peace, security, and stability. It acknowledged the recent inauguration, and there were calls for continued American commitment to the region and eagerness for ASEAN-US meetings. There are also efforts to embrace more partners, where Greece, Netherlands, the UAE, and Qatar will soon accede to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. But as ASEAN-Chair, has Brunei really come to terms with the malignant repercussions of COVID-19 on maritime security? And indeed, if no effective action is taken sooner, transnational crime could further escalate and spill over into more gray zone areas. There is a strong requirement for coastal and ocean management strategies to be better implemented in order to effectively tackle the root drivers behind maritime crime and avoid securitization. Some priorities that have been mentioned is the desire to tackle climate change, plastic pollution, trafficking in persons, transnational crimes. All these would be priorities within ASEAN this year, and they have been reflected in the events set out. But more significance needs to be accorded to these events. They need to be escalated to high-level agenda setting within every regional country. And this can be done through designating more media attention and more conversation around these forums. But above all, Brunei as ASEAN Chair will take on the challenge of fostering more regional coordination and information sharing through the use of these multilateral virtual platforms. COVID-19 has placed a barrier. It has forced distance between regional ministers and policymakers, which could potentially be an obstacle to fostering trust and familiarity. But these policymakers are also demonstrating this increased enthusiasm to want to take part in information sharing in order to offset any sea blindness and continue to maintain their regional relationships. And so this leaves Brunei in an advantageous position to broaden information sharing initiatives. Through benefits offered by technology, it is hoped that Brunei will utilize these virtual platforms to conduct polls, gauge group sentiments, build shared information databases, or conduct virtual tabletop exercises. This approach would address the growing complexity of the maritime environment, but also will be able to accommodate more stakeholders beyond maritime law enforcement agencies. So there's...
Sorry, okay, you finish?
I am nearly done. Can you give me 3 minutes?
Yes, 1-2 minutes. Just 2
Sure.
minutes. Go. Thank you.
2 minutes is perfect. I'm in the conclusion now, where obviously there are more areas that we can address in terms of maritime security. And this is where I actually look forward to the discussion. But I think I want to emphasize that it is important to recognize how much the maritime environment has evolved over the past year. As ASEAN Chair, Brunei is now contending with a maritime environment that is more holistic, with broader implications, with more stakeholders, and with a wider variety of threats. There's actually this recent article that I came across recently from the Bangkok Post I wanted to share. It described Brunei's previous chairmanship in 2013 as sincere, humble, and holistic. And I think if this is any indication of what we can expect from Brunei's chairmanship in 2021, I think then it's quite safe to assume that we are already on the road to recovery, both in terms of regional health and also in terms of maritime security. I want to thank you all very much for your kind patience, and I look forward to the discussion ahead. Don't hesitate to reach out to me here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Asyura Salleh. Thank you for your presentation. I think it's a great presentation in terms of mapping out the challenges that the Brunei chairmanship will have to face in this year, particularly in maritime areas. And definitely, as you mentioned in the conclusion, the chairman will definitely have to engage with more stakeholders in order to face these really mounting challenges in the region, not only in terms of strategic competition, I mean like conventional challenges, but more importantly on non-conventional threats. So now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Rachel Arinii Judhistari from Forum Asia. Please, Rachel.
Thank you so much. I will share my screen.
Sorry, I think your voice is a little bit too little.
Okay, can you hear me now? Is it clear?
Not that clear for me.
Is it better now?
Slightly better. Okay, maybe you should try it first. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, let me try. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Arinii, and today I will present the human rights trajectory in ASEAN during the Brunei chairship. Forum Asia is a human rights network. We have 81 members organization across 21 ASEAN countries, Asian countries, and since 2017 we are accredited by the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. Today I will presenting you the landscape of human rights situation in ASEAN based on our rapid assessment and documentations, as well as analysis of Brunei Chair and some of the best practices from the previous ASEAN-Chair, including Brunei, that can be utilized moving forward. Last June, we did rapid assessment on the effectiveness of ASEAN government during COVID-19, and we supplement the information from our documentations on freedom of expression, assembly, association, and civic space jointly with Civicus. This is the survey respondent, and in a nutshell, I want to inform you that 81% of the survey respondents disagree that ASEAN leaders have successfully protected the rights of the people during the pandemic. I think these perceptions are valid because comparing to other sub-region now, the consolidated response on the pandemic has become slightly a concern for the community here in ASEAN. And then when we asked the participants of the survey on what are the 5 rights that they perceive to be most deteriorated during the pandemic, they are giving us answers like freedom of expression, which is extremely deteriorating, freedom of assembly and associations, human rights defenders, and its safety due to intimidations and also legal case against them, as well as the situation of migrants and refugee rights, mostly due to the Rohingya crisis that still become huge issues in our sub-regions. But lastly, the indigenous people's rights are also mentioned to be one of the rights which are most deteriorating. And this is predominantly affecting women's farmers and also indigenous landowners that are impacted of land grabbings during the pandemic. So another trend that we also see from our documentations is the securitization and striking civic space. We see that 6 out of 10 ASEAN countries have issued emergency decrees, and recently Malaysia just declared a state of emergency until August, which is impacting their ability to conduct free and fair elections. These emergency decrees that started last year has a prolonged impact until now because it provides government and often the security forces like police a range of powers that has been used to further curtail freedom of expression, assembly, associations. The second trend is definitely the violation of freedom of expression, assembly, and associations. We see that within already increasing authoritarian countries, government use the pandemic as a cover to further implement existing policies and has intimidate or disband organizations with the notions that it is part of the government responses. This is also affecting media freedom. We see the disbandment of Rappler and also closure of Tempo newspaper because they're severely impacted by the pandemic. Wait, can you give us? Can you give me 1 second, please? I'm sorry, I just tried to increase the volume of my laptop. Can you hear me better right now?
Very good now, perfect.
Okay, thank you. And then the third trend is surveillance and violation of the rights to privacy. I think the previous speakers also have mentioned about the rise of surveillance, but we see the use of contact tracing applications as part of the critical response of governments are needed. However, it is being utilized out of proportions. And our region have a very lax data protections policies, which might create future challenges in terms of the privacy rights protections. Another trend that we see, which is positive but also negative, is the digitalization of civic space. We see that this time frame is an opportune moment for civil society because civil society organizations are utilizing online platform to do mobilizations, to do outreach, but it also includes risk of having online sexual gender-based violence, as well as cyber attack and doxing, among others. The impact of COVID-19 is also exacerbations of pre-existing inequalities and vulnerabilities of marginalized groups. We see that there are still lack of immediate response for daily wage earners and other informal sector workers, and this is severely affecting women and LGBTIQ communities due to the high potential of domestic abuse and violence during the lockdown. We also see that the pandemic affecting the reproductive health supply shortage because contraceptions and life-saving medicines for people living with HIV need to be imported. And then during the pandemic, we also see it as a search of economic cooperation and policy. This is important for the benefit of expediting the economic advancement because we are currently dealing with recessions. However, lack of safeguard and participations of CSOs might impacting farmers, indigenous communities, and women negatively. And I think the previous speakers have talked about Brunei priority as ASEAN-Chair with the themes of we care, we prepare, and we prosper. And the interesting thing that I also want to highlight is usually ASEAN will have 2 summits in the beginning of the year and then also later of the year. But this year, Brunei is planning to only have 1 summit in October. And hopefully this can be done offline because of some limitation in online spaces. But let's see the development of pandemic during that time. But definitely the teams really highlight the priority of Brunei as chair, which is caring for people's and others' well-being, preparations for future opportunities and challenges, and prospering together as a unified region. In addition, during the economic pillars, Brunei also shared their 10 economic priorities as chair. So they're focused on 3 aspects: recovery, especially on tourism, and new partnerships with trade agreement, including with Canada, the digitalizations, especially for e-commerce and creation of a safe digital ecosystem, and third is the sustainable economic growth, and they have include the support to micro, medium, and cooperations in the areas of minerals. So Forum Asia analysis of Brunei chairship is looking at 2 aspects: the enablers for human rights issues to be addressed, and also some of the challenges. I will focus first on the enablers. I think it's good that Brunei as a chair has focused on digitalization, and not only that, they also put the word safety as part of the digitalization, which is very crucial. However, the definition of safety might be not as comprehensive or slightly different with what civil society wants, because rather than safety, we also want our privacy rights to be protected. And the second enabler is Brunei's commitment for the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, which is good because it already includes human rights and gender mainstreaming approach. And third is COVID-19 responses. Has been ongoing, and the sole focus of it is for people's well-being. We also see the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights term of reference is currently being reviewed, and the recent ASEAN Foreign Minister meeting have highlighted their plan to follow up the women, peace, and security issues, which is a very good trend and enablers to talk about human rights. The recent ASEAN Foreign Ministers retreat also seek to reaffirm the UNFCCC, which talk about climate justice and protections. So these are some enablers that we can get from Brunei as the chair. But some of the challenges remain. For example, the absence of human rights prioritizations and the focus on macroeconomic development, because we see throughout the Brunei thematic priorities, the word human rights have not been mentioned there. So it is one of the key challenge, and also internal homework of restricted or even closed civic space. The norm of democracy, the norm of meaningful people engagement is something that might not be as familiar for Brunei. And we also can see the pernicious penal code against LGBTIQ within Brunei that still become a challenges until now. Another challenges that we see is also safety, privacy, and digital divide of online platforms. I think one of the core principles of ASEAN is people-centered. And throughout the years, the government of ASEAN have been managed to do interface meeting between ASEAN leaders and civil society organization in person. However, given the transformations to utilize digital spaces, these still become a challenges. Another things that we are also concerned of is about the rights to privacy and safety, given the focus on digitalization of Brunei. We also see the lack of robust response and human rights protections on the impact of COVID-19, because when we benchmarking the response of ASEAN with other regional mechanism like African Union, the Inter-American organizations, start from the beginning of the pandemic, they have created a complaint mechanism. That's where the peoples of other sub-regions can submit complaint about health rights, about fundamental freedom, etc. But we have not have that in our regions. And then we also see bigger challenge of economic recessions that definitely will impacting the ability of governments to focus on addressing human rights issues. And then the travel restrictions and worsening pandemic situation persist. So definitely this will also affecting Brunei's role as chair in achieving consensus among other countries. Throughout the years, we also see how RCEP becoming the new focus in the region. And this might risking greater influence of China and have possible impact to equality and probably will bypass trade diversified opportunities. So that's some of our analysis on Brunei as a chair. But regarding the role of the chair, I don't want to say that the chair is the only moving factor of ASEAN. No, they are very instrumental, but yet like other countries will also have similar role to boost the human rights agenda for ASEAN. And I want to highlight some of the best practices that the previous ASEAN chair have done to address human rights issues and meaningful engagement of civil society. Because in 2009, we see Thailand as chair of ASEAN at the time, leading the discussions on the creation of ASEAN human rights mechanism as follow-up of the ASEAN-Charter. We also see how in 2011, the Indonesian Ministry of Foreign Affairs firmly shared that human rights is their top priority as ASEAN chair. This verbal commitment followed by action is very important because this kind of specific commitment will boost issues and also follow-ups of human rights issues within the regions. We also see how in 2014 and 2019, Malaysia and Thailand as chair hosted an interface meeting between CSOs and ASEAN foreign ministers. In fact, in 2019, Thailand even provide funding for the CSO gathering. So these best practices is already started since a decade ago. We also see how in 2017 and 2018, Philippines and Singapore as chair has enabling discussion on the Rakhine situation, especially on the refugee crisis of Rohingya people. And it is included as part of the chair statement. So this is something that we can learn from the previous chair, and I'm sure Brunei will be able to amplify its ability to address the human rights issues within the region that we see deteriorating. Some of the key recommendations from us on how Brunei as chair can improve the human rights situations that currently become a challenge is to focus on addressing human rights issues, not only as a chair of ASEAN, but also internally as a country. And secondly, we also see how Brunei's role would be very instrumental to ensure that human rights approach are embedded within the implementation of the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, and expediting the review of the ASEAN Human Rights Mechanism term of reference. We also hope that Brunei as chair can integrate this synergy approach between the three ASEAN pillars. We think that each of the pillars are complemented with each other. So would be also good to not only talk about economic issues, but see how other pillars like social cultural and also the political security can complement with economic pillars, and making sure that human rights is a core of the discussion as embedded within the ASEAN Charter. Lastly, we really want to ensure that the Brunei government as chair of ASEAN enable a meaningful engagement of civil society organizations. And through the online meeting, we hope that it is able to be done. But we also hope if during the summit of ASEAN, Brunei is able to do it offline, an interface meeting between ASEAN leaders and CSOs need to be prioritized. That's all from me, and that's my contact. Would be really good to have a follow-up discussions on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Very comprehensive presentation again. What I think the key point is like a lot of homeworks for the chairman to do this year, especially in the human rights area. I think there's a development, of course, in terms of engagement with civil society, because there is an interface meeting, as you mentioned earlier. But of course, with the pandemic situation, this interface meeting certainly face challenges, and of course there are a lot of other challenges that we as ASEAN need to face, and we hope that the Brunei chairmanship can certainly make some progress in it. So now I would like to give the floor to Her Excellency Diedrah Kelly, Ambassador of Canada Mission to ASEAN. And certainly we hope to hear your ideas, your views on how the collaboration with partner countries such as Canada can be formed in helping ASEAN to address the current challenges and its future agenda and vision. I give now the floor to Her Excellency, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is fantastic to be back here with you at CSIS, albeit virtually, to see some familiar faces. Hello, Rachel. Hello, Fitri, and to make some new acquaintances as well. So Dr. Lina, Dr. Mantong, Dr. Vermonte, nice to meet you virtually. I think as mentioned by the first speaker, this meeting is timely. It is the first month of ASEAN's new chairman to be at the helm, Brunei, and many countries, including Canada, who are dialogue partners of ASEAN, have been carefully monitoring events, have been adapting to the realities of the pandemic, and have been giving a lot of thought as to what we can do to help move forward ASEAN's agenda, whether that be in terms of existing activities or any of the new priorities that have been identified by Brunei. And as mentioned as well by Rachel, there is a specific mention of Canada with regard to the economic priorities of Brunei. So I can touch on that as well in terms of sharing what it is that we hope to accomplish and why we think that would be of value in terms of expanding partnerships in the region. I think that if you look back, Canada has shared many milestones with ASEAN that have helped to achieve our mutual interests. And even though Canada and ASEAN are geographically divided by the Pacific Ocean, our common values and understanding lies with our people-to-people, cultural, commercial ties, as well as other shared interests that outweigh any of those geographic barriers. And harmony in diversity and inclusivity is fundamental to Canada. And we believe that it's also fundamental to a people-centered ASEAN community, and that aligns with where ASEAN is hoping to go, we believe. And so it resonates with Canada because it's something we experience on a daily basis. It's something that we're proud of, diversity, and that we work hard to ensure inclusivity within our borders and with all of our partners, including with ASEAN. And that means for us trying to truly listen and not impose our views on others. And it also means understanding that our decisions and actions can impact one part of the planet differently from another, especially during a pandemic like COVID-19. And so international partnerships need to adapt to this reality in order to be fit for purpose. And if we think about what we have all experienced over nearly the past year, and adjusting to new normals, as we commonly refer them, there has been a lot of changes and a lot of unprecedented challenges. And we have been able to achieve some success working with ASEAN in that regard. So in particular, there is a longstanding project that we have been implementing on mitigating biological threats that has been running since 2013. And some of you have heard me speak to this project before. Its sole purpose was on preventing, detecting, and responding to infectious disease outbreaks like COVID-19. And as a result of those efforts, a lot of the regional health authorities have been better connected. There's been better data sharing, better risk analysis, and trend reporting, both in terms of traditional relationships, institution to institution relationships, but also adapting and using new technologies. So there's a Canadian company, for example, called Blue Dot, which combines artificial intelligence and public health and medical expertise and advanced data analytics to track, contextualize, and anticipate trends with regard to outbreaks. And that is one example, but I think it's one that defines how Canada and ASEAN have been able to anticipate challenges, to have in place meaningful relationships, but also to be able to pivot and change course quickly as necessary. And so this year, when we look at Brunei's chairmanship, we have welcomed the spirit that they have introduced, and we think that it reflects the posture we have to maintain, especially during this new reality and as we undertake a post-pandemic recovery. In terms of how we are going to be supporting Brunei's chairmanship, first, if we explore the economic pillar, and I'm starting here given the fact that Canada has been specifically mentioned, we have a number of guiding principles. So first, there is an ASEAN-Canada Joint Declaration on Trade and Investment, which outlines how Canada and ASEAN will work together towards better regional economic integration. As part of that, we recently concluded a new economic work plan as part of the 2021 to 2015 work plan for ASEAN and Canada that focuses on increasing involvement of the business community and promoting mutual trade and investment in the years to come. Despite the pandemic, our trade and economic relationship continues to be strong and growing. And ASEAN region as a bloc is Canada's 6th largest trading partner, which is quite impressive. And the Canadian direct investment to ASEAN continues to increase significantly. In 2019, it equaled $17.5 billion. And the same year, we saw foreign direct investment from ASEAN into Canada, about $526 million. And so we think there's potential to grow that two-way direct investment. In terms of an FTA agreement, you know, that has been stated as a priority this year under one of Brunei's economic pillars. And of course, it's a high priority for Canada as well. And we think that it would be a signal to the world that we share a commitment to open rules-based trade, particularly in the context of COVID-19 recovery efforts. It would provide an even stronger basis for ASEAN and Canadian businesses to access new markets and supply chains. And therefore, we are going to be doing everything possible to work with Brunei to launch those negotiations. And I think what's interesting about Canada's trade diversification approach is the emphasis that we are trying to put on areas like small and medium enterprises, but also recognizing the particular challenges that exist for women and other minority and traditionally disadvantaged communities, and trying to open doors for those groups. And also paying attention to issues like the environment and making sure that the opportunities that we are creating are not only going to have immediate benefit, but that they will continue to benefit generations to come. And that's something that is front and center in terms of our diversification strategy, and we hope one that will resonate with ASEAN countries as well. In terms of the socio-cultural pillar, there are a number of initiatives that we have been supporting in the past and that we hope to expand moving forward. So one example is a project called Triangle. It's a project undertaken between ASEAN and Australia and the ILO. And the purpose is to promote and protect the rights of migrant workers. Given that we have seen these groups become even more vulnerable during the pandemic, I think that this is an example of, you know, critical work that needs to be front and center during the next year, but also, you know, likely in the 2 to 3 year period, or even longer following the impact of the pandemic. We also have a project that we have spearheaded with ASEAN and the OECD called COPAS, and that looks at supporting micro, small, and medium enterprises, and it has a particular focus on women entrepreneurs. So we hope that that will continue to bring benefit to the ASEAN region. We have also been supporting education opportunities. There's a scholarship program called SEEDS, Sustainable Economic Exchanges for Development, which in the past has provided up to 150 students annually the opportunity to undertake studies in Canada. We have seen challenges during the pandemic, but tried to be as creative as possible to continue to allow those exchanges to persist. So whether that was exploring virtual opportunities, but really given that the in-person study is one of the great benefits of this project, ensuring that where universities were continuing to accept international students in Canada, that those opportunities be supported, and finding creative ways to support additional costs like quarantine costs in Canada or COVID-19 screening for the masses of students that were going. And then the third pillar of ASEAN, of course, is the political security pillar. Again, our plan of action for the period of 2021 to 2025 outlines a number of areas where we will continue to be supportive. Maritime security has been a particular focus for Canada. Under the ASEAN Regional Forum, Canada has been supporting a number of workshops focused on maritime security, as well as on UNCLOS, an attempt to advance the code of conduct efforts. And that is something that we certainly hope will see some progress this year, given that it continues to take up more space in the international agenda and is increasingly becoming an irritant for the region. So that is, in our view, an area that requires prioritization as well. We continue to support a number of efforts to combat transnational crime, whether that be in areas of counterterrorism or cybersecurity, again, maritime security, and the various ways that that can pop its head in terms of creative crime, but also in terms of military to military support. So Canada offers training opportunities. We support regional exercises as well as monitoring exercises to prevent and deter sanctions breaking, for example, in the region. And then we are committed to supporting fundamental organizations in ASEAN and helping them get stronger legs, whether that's the Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, ASEAN-Chair, or the Commission on the Protection and Promotion of Rights of Women and Children, the ACWC, which fundamentally aligns with Canada's international feminist foreign policy and international feminist assistance policy. So it's about supporting not only ASEAN and its institutions, but also about supporting its people. We do this through various programming envelopes, such as the Canada Fund for Local Initiatives, but also in terms of engaging with civil society. And we believe that promoting civil society is an important way to gain experience and expertise, especially through local grassroots organizations, given that they often have the best ground truth and perspectives to share on policy change, legislative change, or even practical solutions that can quickly and effectively reach the populations. And that applies in ASEAN as well. So last but not least, as I said earlier, one of the values that we believe we share with the ASEAN region and that we believe is at the core of where ASEAN wants to go is the belief in diversity and respecting that diversity. And I just would like to emphasize in closing that in Canada, we have learned that diversity is not only a source of creativity, but it also leads to resilience and strengths and makes us richer in every sense. And so we encourage ASEAN and its member states, including Brunei, as it fulfills its role as chair in 2021, to embrace the diversity that exists in every form and take advantage of the wealth that that provides. And when governments and citizens choose inclusion, its economic, social, cultural, and democratic benefits can only then be fully realized. So we don't have a perfect model to copy, but I think we have some good intentions and we have some good history of positive change in our track record and hope to build on that with Brunei moving forward so that we can care, we can prosper, and we can see positive change. So thank you very much for letting us share what Canada plans to do to work with ASEAN, but also specifically in support of Brunei's chairmanship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Her Excellency. I think it's a very great presentation by the ambassador. As ambassador already elaborates various areas of cooperation with ASEAN as a regional institution. And I think all the cooperations is very, very useful for ASEAN. And we certainly hope for expanding partnership with Canada as a very useful partner for ASEAN. So now I would like to open the floor for questions and answer here. I have 6 questions in total, and let me start with the first question. I think it probably directed to Andrew. The question is, do you think the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework goes far enough to address the various challenges that the region would have to tackle in the foreseeable future? If not, what areas need more attention or adjustment? Okay, that's the first question. The second question goes to Ambassador Kelly. Canada is believed as one of the few dialogue partners of ASEAN that does not yet have strategic partnership relations with the regional organization. Do you see this changing in the near future? And also on top of that, also I think it's pretty much quite similar question, but there's also a question where the ambassador can elaborate more on the new ASEAN-Canada Plan of Action 2021-2025. If you look at various ASEAN documents with its dialogue partners, we tend to see similar issues repeated in these documents. Thus, it is assumed that ASEAN pursues similar objectives in its partnership with all dialogue partners. To what extent did Canada insert Canada's own issues of interest in the creation of the new plan of action? Okay. And another question is goes to Forum Asia, to Rachel. How to make human rights a pertinent issue for ASEAN amidst COVID-19 impacts that push member states to focus more on economic recovery? Is there any way to conduct regional economic recovery that also support or focus on the protection and promotion of human rights? And one question goes to Dr. Asyura Salleh. In recent years, Brunei was seen as a silent claimant over the spread list. How likely that posture will affect or be affected by Brunei's attempt to finalize the COC during its chairmanship? If I can add a little bit, probably maybe you can give some view also, as the current Brunei chairmanships also happen to be at the same time we are having the ASEAN Secretary General from Brunei as well, whether it's an advantage or there is no added point to that. Okay, I think I stopped there. Then the other questions will go to the second round. I now give the floor to Andrew first to respond to the question.
Okay. Thank you, Lina, for the questions. It's not easy to answer the questions whether the current plan is already comprehensive or not. But if we have a brief look into this document, it already outlines several strategies. There are 5 strategies to qualify as the sort of ASEAN comprehensive recovery framework. So it includes enhancing health systems, it includes strengthening human security, it seeks to maximize the potential of intra-ASEAN market and broader economic integration, it seeks to accelerate inclusive digital transformation, and it seeks to advance towards a more sustainable and resilient future. It looks comprehensive indeed, but you know, there are some, how can I say this? If we're looking at what is missed by this so-called comprehensive framework, is actually the roots of the vulnerabilities caused by the current pandemic. Some economists has already mentioned that this is already most unequal crisis happening in already unequal times. So it means during the pandemics, those that are most vulnerable for the pandemic is those that has been living without necessary supports from modern bureaucracies such as welfare bureaucracies, insurance, and so on and so forth. So people has been debating about how can we ensure compliance when we have health protocols? How can we ensure people to stay at home? But recently, I have this experience where my cousins and my aunties suffered for COVID-19, and in order to isolate them in a fully functioning home, it requires and it takes a lot of societal efforts. It takes the whole family to isolate only 1 or 2 people at their home. So it means that when it comes to health protocols, there are a lot of state capacity needed. There are a lot of concerted efforts that is needed. And what does it mean is to mobilize support and resources. And the questions about the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework is whether these kind of strategies would be equipped by a very systematic fashion in order to ensure that there would be some sort of pooling of resources happen at regional level. That's the first question. And the second question is, this is, I think, a paradigmatic question. Are we sort of trapped in the so-called supply side economics? Because when it comes to the pandemic, those are most vulnerable are those who are working in informal sectors. And the problem with working with informal sectors are sometimes these people are not supported by a good insurance. Sometimes it's not legible as well. They don't fall into the the good data. They don't. For example, in Jakarta, if you live in the flat in crowded areas in Jakarta, how does your data goes to? How is your how are you registered in the government data? So when we are talking about accelerating digital futures, accelerating the 4th industrial revolutions, and celebrating how the pandemic has accelerated the digitalizations of business, we also have to remember that there are some people who are increasingly untouched by the benefit of these industrializations. And we seek, and at least at the regional level, as well as national level, we should start to think about how to enlarge the coverage of insurance, enlarge the coverage of welfare bureaucracies to those people working in these informal sectors. And that, by saying that, is already another kind of economic talks, which is demand side economics. We talk about saving the supply chain economics and so on and so forth. But I think at some point, ASEAN has also come up together to think about how do we coordinate macroeconomic policies that mostly goes to how protecting this kind of people, including informal workers, and then people who are living under the standards of welfare. I think that would be my answer.
Thank you, Andrew. Now I give the time to Dr. Asyura Salleh to respond to the questions directed to her.
Thanks very much for the question. I think that's a good one. I think that there are 3 sections to this question, to this answer. The first would be that I think it's important to really look at Brunei's position towards the territorial disputes, not solely as a silent claimant. I mentioned in my talk that we need to broaden our understanding of the different postures that countries are taking towards the territorial disputes in terms of different variants of hedging. And Brunei is no different in doing so. And honestly, its priority as of now is to really facilitate a calm and peaceful environment. Brunei is currently pursuing as it mentioned in its diplomatic note, a 2-pronged strategy, which is to address the issue bilaterally and at the same time to adopt a regional approach in order to try push forward and conclude the code of conduct in accordance to UNCLOS. Obviously, we need to be realistic that on the fact that COVID-19 has imposed some obstacles in really trying to conclude the code of conduct. And although it is hoped, and we can have, we can only hope that the COC would be concluded by this year, but I think it's important to be realistic that there are some sensitive issues which cannot be negotiated through virtual platforms. And it is important to do so physically, but yet we are unable to do so under the current conditions. And because of this, some work may need to be shelved, or the pace of negotiations may need to go a bit slower. And in terms of your comment really on whether having an ASEAN SACJET from Brunei would actually be an advantage, I think it would particularly be so in terms of the fact that we are operating under existential conditions as of now. And I think we will be able to see a smoother organization of events as we're able to enhance liaising between the ASEAN Secretariat and also the Brunei Foreign Ministry. And this is something that will actually be advantageous considering the challenges imposed by COVID-19. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Asyura. Now I give the floor to Rachel to respond to the questions, please.
Sure. I think it's 1 million questions on how to making sure that human rights is a priority in ASEAN. But allow me to say that actually the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Plan have include commitment to mainstreaming human rights within ASEAN activities. However, the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Plan is not set in stone. It's a living document according to the leaders of ASEAN. So it is very important for us to making sure that civil society organizations are engaged in the review process of the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Plan. In another ways to mainstream human rights is to also requesting Brunei as chair to make it as a chair priority. Because Brunei chairship is not only affecting the ASEAN summit, but it's also affecting the ministerial meeting, the ASEAN Human Rights Mechanism meeting, etc. So it is one key recommendations that we would like to convey to Brunei to really mainstream and prioritizing human rights as ASEAN agenda. And another ways to do this is to also utilize the ASEAN Human Rights Mechanism complaint. Because for the past 10 years, civil society organizations, academicians have been lobbying for the creation of a complaint mechanism. And now since last November, the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights have created a complaint mechanism. So you can send your complaint without any format to ichair@asean.org. Hopefully that can really leverage the prioritization of the issues. And on the second agenda on how to make sure that economic recovery is utilizing human rights approach, I would like to also inviting you to understand that the pandemic is not only an economic crisis, it is a multidimensional crisis that affecting public health, human rights, education, etc. So in order to address the multidimensional crisis, then our approach need to be also multidimensional. And it is important to making sure that the new normal that we have, especially for economic recovery, is looking at the UN guiding principle on business and human rights, to making sure that we don't leave anyone behind, to making sure that we're not only focused on macroeconomic policies, but to include migrant workers, indigenous women, women farmers, as well as those who are working in a micro enterprise and informal jobs, including migrants. So I think with that understanding in mind, sustainability of the people's well-being, as highlighted by Brunei, need to be prioritized over macroeconomic blanket to boost GDP without considering the raising inequalities within the sub-regions. I would like to stop on that, and thank you so much again for the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Ambassador Kelly, your time to respond to the questions, please. Thank you.
Great. So there were two questions. The first was on the issue of strategic partnership. And I should clarify, at this point, Canada is the only one of the 10 dialogue partners to ASEAN that does not have strategic partnership, given that the EU recently upgraded their status, had their status upgraded to strategic partnership. Canada is entering into its 44th year of partnership with ASEAN, 44 years that we have been a dialogue partner to ASEAN. And during that time, we have been supporting ASEAN objectives across a range of issues and have been partnered with ASEAN member states and the organization as the region transformed and progressed. And I think we have silently been in the background, working as a partner and a friend to ASEAN. We haven't been one of the loudest partners, but we have certainly been an effective one, and we have seen a maturity of our relationship over the course of those 44 years. So yes, absolutely. We think that given the fact that Canada has been a stable and committed partner during that period, and that we continue to see our areas of cooperation grow every year, that the time is definitely ripe for our relationship to be elevated to that of strategic partnership. And hopefully we will see gains in that objective this year. In terms of the plan of action, as was rightly noted, there are many similarities between the documents that are negotiated between dialogue partners and ASEAN. And there is a very simple reason for that. I believe everyone is aware that ASEAN is a consensus-based organization. And so the plans of action that are developed between ASEAN and its partners are reflective of common goals that are held and identified by ASEAN member states. And so there is that thread of similarity in each of the documents that are negotiated with the member states. What will happen is ASEAN member states will identify a range of priorities across the 3 pillars of ASEAN, and will state to the dialogue partner, in our case Canada, what they hope to see in terms of partnership and specific action in areas of collaboration over a 5-year period. So it's a coordination document that is aligned to ASEAN's objectives and agreed upon by all of the ASEAN member states. And then it's a way for ASEAN and Canada to flesh out what that cooperation can look like. So in terms of imposing, our own objectives, difficult to do so given that the document really is a reflection of ASEAN's priorities. But rather than it being, a statement of Canadian objectives, I think it's more an indication of what Canada can bring to the table and what Canada's value added is with regard to the priority areas identified by ASEAN. For example, in terms of economy 4.0, we definitely, or industry 4.0, Canada has a lot of expertise in artificial intelligence in areas like clean technologies and ag technology. And so if that's an area that we have that might not be as rich in other dialogue partners, then that's something that we would want to showcase. Or in terms of education, if there are certain education opportunities available that can help advance ASEAN's Industry 4.0, then that would be an area that we would want to highlight. The fact that we are looking to launch negotiations of a free trade agreement, there is clearly a range of capacity that exists in the ASEAN region, and so making available third-party expertise that would help make a more common baseline in terms of the foundations in various trade policy areas. Or if it's on maritime security issues, if we have a particular expertise in maritime law, or in terms of experience putting together policy and legislation that can benefit Indigenous populations or protect migrant laborers, then that's the type of knowledge and expertise that we would bring to the table. So it's more a document that outlines ASEAN's shared priorities, the vision that they would like to move towards, and a way to coordinate and showcase how dialogue partners can help them achieve those goals.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now for the final round, because we only have around maybe 12 minutes to go. So for the final round questions, there's a question from Simone Galimberti from Engage, probably directed to Rachel, if I see the nature of the question. In your view or your knowledge, is there any issues related to human rights that the CSOs in the region can work with counterparts in Brunei, like to find other ways to promote civil society-led agenda, but at the same time, it's probably the issues that might not come easy for Brunei, if there's any, you might share with ASEAN. And also, I think it's an open question to everybody. There are two open questions. The first one is from Shafia Muhibat in terms of, is it too early to predict ASEAN's relations with the US under Biden? Are there any interesting implications to ASEAN that we can expect, like any impact on the dynamics of ASEAN's relations with dialogue partners in East Asia Summit, ADMM+, and so on? And also, there's also a very interesting question from Apichai Suchinda. The questions on the position of ASEAN Secretary General. It has been so far, we always have a male Secretary General. Do you think, from the four presenters, how do you see the possibility of having a female Secretary General in the future? Maybe, of course, well, yeah, for the next term, for example. And let me see. Yeah, I think that's yeah, just some of the questions. Yeah, okay. So now I give the floor to Rachel. I now give the floor to Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you. So yes, in short, I want to say yes, the regional organizations and also CSOs from other countries are very keen to work with CSOs in Brunei. In fact, we are also part of the ASEAN People Forum / ASEAN Civil Society Conference. And we have our Brunei counterparts started the preparations to do the ASEAN People's Summit for this year. And given the limitations of travel restrictions, majority of the activities will be online. And our discussions will also include issues such as clean technology, the digitalization of civic space, and the safety of human rights defenders. So we really hope that the Brunei government as ASEAN-Chair support the convening of civil society organizations in Brunei or online, because in 2014, Brunei government also provided that support to civil society organizations. However, if we wish things can be further accelerated, we really hope that this year the Brunei government is able to act as a facilitators of meeting between civil society organization and ASEAN leaders during the ASEAN Summit and other relevant process to making sure that the engagement between civil society organization and ASEAN mechanism is not tokenistic. That's all for me. And I think the question about US-ASEAN relationship is very interesting and timely. It is very good to note that the recent ASEAN foreign ministers retreat have included welcoming message to Biden administrations. And I really hope, given Biden's priority for clean technologies, the transfer of informations can be happen in our sub-region as well to making sure sustainable development for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. For the second questions, probably Dr. Asyura, you can respond to it, and Andrew later, and Ambassador, of course, if you want to also give some response. Please, Dr. Asyura.
Sure, thanks. I actually thought to address the two things I'd like to address: U.S. relationship with ASEAN under Biden, and also there's another question on what would be the trajectory of China's influence in ASEAN
Yes.
2021. Yeah, so the first, I'd start from the last question. The first is that I think we should be a bit more realistic about what we can expect from China in terms of their activities on the South China Sea. I think we are expecting to see more forward projection behavior. I mentioned that there is the active expansion of naval bases in my talk, but also I think there is a movement towards more gray zone tactics. And this is really where transnational crimes such as IUU fishing, illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing would tend to overlap with more traditional security interests. In fact, recently China passed a law to give power to its coast guards to really start firing on foreign vessels and remove certain structures at sea. Therefore, we will see a lot more deployment of maritime militia at sea, and this has in fact already been set precedents with China's activities in 2020 towards regional states. But I think we also need to recognize that we're also getting a lot more activity from other states and other powers in the region. Taiwan, for example, was recently detained in the Tuna Sea for illegal fishing. Royal Malaysian Navy has received their littoral mission ships, and also Bakamla has been outfitting its ships with more machine guns. So we're seeing a lot more modernization and more activity, not just from China, but also quite broadly across the region. When we look at the US presidency, I think that we can expect a lot more predictability from the Biden administration. There is a call actually at the recent survey conducted on Southeast Asian survey done by ICES that there is a preference for the next US administration to really achieve a balance in how it seeks to move forward with ASEAN and the region. Perhaps it would be great if the United States was not too accommodating, but also not too confrontational and assertive as well. In terms of the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think Biden will continue with several tenets under the strategy. Not sure if the name will change. America has a tendency of constantly changing the name of their strategy depending on which new administration comes in. But I do hope that we will get more senior level ambassadors to ASEAN, and also that Biden will be able to show up at some of the mechanisms that ASEAN will be holding. And this would be such as the EAS and even the ASEAN-US Summit meeting. I'm hoping for the Secretary of State to also be able to attend the ARF and the EAS Foreign Minister meeting. Nevertheless, I think we can realistically expect more freedom of navigation operations by the United States and a constant, continuous challenge to China's actions at sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Asyura. Sorry, I missed just one question by Karen Pudianta that Dr. Asyura just responded. So the question is, what is the trajectory of China influence in ASEAN 2021? Should we expect a relatively calmer South China Sea? So Andrew, you want to give some view on this?
Yes, just a bit. Thank you for the questions. I also noticed that there have been one question from Zaki asking about the possibility of UK becoming the ASEAN full dialogue partners. To generally answer to these questions is, I think I have to remind that there are something clearly different between major powers relations with ASEAN and major power relations with ASEAN countries. Sometimes when we are asking about what is the future of Biden administration's policy towards ASEAN, what is the futures of, for example, Korean, Chinese, Japan policy towards ASEAN, sometimes there are a bit blurred lines between differentiating major power response to ASEAN as major power response to ASEAN countries. What I would like to emphasize here is sometimes what we are seeing is from the ASEAN sides, is ASEAN is treated as the sum of hedging measures taken nationally by each ASEAN member states. So it's a pool of hedging measures taken and brought up to the regional level. It sort of explains how ASEAN is being cohered and how ASEAN is being built until now. With regards to the questions of whether the US and the China influence, sometimes scholars use the adjective of the US with the so-called US commitment, whether US commitment would be reliable in the future and whether the Chinese intentions would be predictable in the future. So it's a balance between commitment and intentions that seek ASEAN and continuously put ASEAN in recalibrating its hedging measures toward these major powers. And sometimes when it comes to ASEAN centrality, we really have to look at how ASEAN works internally to make sure and then to manage their external relations. There are a stark difference in how US engage ASEAN versus China engage ASEAN. I think China is more similar to China, to Japan and Korea in building this kind of internally attached funding mechanism, like Japan ASEAN Integration Fund attached to the ASEAN Secretariat, while the US is using more this kind of program-based approach. So when I have to predict what is the future of Biden relationship with ASEAN, with ASEAN, is I think it's going back to whether there would be some symbolic measures that could be undone by the US government, will sometimes Biden attending some of the ASEAN summits, and what kind of programs that US will use to approach ASEAN. Will there would be some changes? Would US invest in ASEAN? Will US invest in building up ASEAN centrality and so on and so forth? Or will US just using their own usual kind of program approach to deal with ASEAN? There are a bit plus and minus with regards to this kind of approaches. And sometimes it also goes back to the questions of ASEAN centrality. How do we manage this? So it's not really up to Biden whether the future cooperation would be contributive towards ASEAN development. It's also up to us. How can we make sure that there would not be some overlaps? How can we make sure that we can use a good external supports from the US, from Korea, from Japan, from China, in order to build our own capacity. So this is not only about whether Biden is serious or not. We think about US commitment, but I think the commitment is there. But whether the commitment would be translated from symbolic commitment into workable commitments is not really up to only to US, but it's also up to the ASEAN, and it's also up to national government of each ASEAN member states. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Ambassador Kelly, do you have any view on the Biden administration to ASEAN?
Sure, thank you for the question. I think, it's definitely an interesting question. And everyone is trying to predict how the new administration is going to impact their relationship, the US relationship with various bilateral constructs or regional organizations like ASEAN. I think there's the symbolic gestures that were referenced. And as stated by the previous speaker, it will very much be dependent on what ASEAN would like to see in terms of symbolic gestures and what ASEAN asks of the US and how the US is able to respond. But I think it's also important to go beyond those symbolic gestures and to look at, what has the US been doing in the region. And I think if one scratches beneath the surface, they'll see that, the US engagement in the region, has been strong throughout even the last administration. So there's the symbolic gestures that everyone pays attention to, and there's a lot of analysis, but then there's also that, what is the sustained level of activity and engagement and scope of the relationship? And I think we've seen that has continued throughout. I think there's another point I'd like to address, and that is on the question of, would it be a benefit to ASEAN to see a female Secretary General? And I would say yes. I think that is something that we would like to see in ASEAN at some point. The current Secretary General has done a great job. There has been some incredible accomplishments achieved, for example, the successful negotiation of RCEP. But Canada, as you know, is very much focused on gender equality and has feminist international assistance and foreign policies. And we definitely attempt to apply a feminist lens to everything that we undertake, including our foreign relations. So I think that would be a welcome change from a Canadian perspective at some point in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. So just for the last question, maybe just very quick from Dr. Asyura Salleh and Andrew Mantong. As Ambassador mentioned also, the gender equality is very important. So on the questions of a possibility of having Secretary General, a woman Secretary General. Just very quick response to that. Please, Dr. Asyura Salleh and Andrew.
Sorry, Vaimi. I think that, of course, being female myself, I think it's absolutely important for the region to promote gender equality. And this needs to be broadened right across the region. And I hope that each regional country will be able to support their women in more senior positions and eventually uphold them to be able to hold such a position as an ASEAN sector. And that is something that all women in the region should eventually aspire to. And I look forward to all progress towards that.
Thank you. Andrew, please.
It's a very interesting question, and I'm all for gender equality and for women leadership. If there is something interesting about healthcare, is we use care. You know, when we describe healthcare, we use care, and sometimes with all this kind of pandemic war-making situations, fighting against pandemics, sometimes we forget this kind of care dimensions. And I really believe that, as performed by some women leadership in some national government, sometimes women leadership is more catered toward this kind of function. And again, this is not only about moral, but this is more about, you know, feminist side of any kind of performative leadership that can be performed by any kind of gender. So yes, there would be some there would be a good idea. But it also goes back to the question that the Secretary General is actually political appointee. So it is up to internal dynamics of national governments, internal dynamics of politics, and whether the politics has been conducive to elevate and to give some kind of more room for woman leadership. So it's secondary questions of the national politics that leads towards the regional politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. So now we come to the end of our discussion today. Of course, there's no conclusion because we can make our own conclusion out of the discussion. I think it's a very, very dynamic discussion that we have with very distinguished and excellent speakers. And what we hope is for Brunei to make good use of the time of its chairmanship, to make every effort to materialize, to realize its vision in order to make ASEAN better. And externally, of course, there is also an expectation, a hope, to expand partnership with with ASEAN dialogue partners, to enable ASEAN and dialogue partners both to reap fruits from their cooperation. Of course, it's for the common prosperity and security. With that, I end the discussion today, and please join me to thank all the speakers, excellent speakers that we have, Her Excellency Ambassador Diedrah Kelly, and Dr. Asyura Salleh, Andrew Mantong, and of course Rachel Arinii, and she apologized to leave a bit earlier before we end the discussion. Thank you everyone. Thank you. Have a nice afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.